In this chapter, we will be talking about quadrilaterals, and our standard is that we will be categorizing shapes by their shared attributes. So, a quadrilateral is anything that has four sides. So this is a shape with four sides. And then from that, we will learn about all of these other shapes and the ways that they connect with one another. So today, we will need to know about how to differentiate between angles, diagonals, and sides. So when we are talking about angles, these are things that are inside the shape. We've talked about this a little bit, but like angle A, we see here. Diagonal, these are lines that connect angles that are across from each other. So if I look at this is diagonal AC. And then sides, these are outside of the shape. We've talked a lot about this. This is side CY. So using this information, you should have your booklet in front of you, and we are going to make our reference sheet. So it is very important that you make sure that your paper looks just like mine, because as we go through these problems, we will then be using this booklet in the future in order to remember what our properties are and how those properties then end up working together. So to start us off, we are going to look at a parallelogram. Now, a parallelogram is kind of the foundational point at which we're going to start, and it has the most amount of properties. So it's going to have diagonals that bisect each other. So this word bisect, in math, we use this to think about cutting in half. And each half is congruent to the other half. And remember that symbol for congruent is the squiggle over the equal sign. So that means that this half of the diagonal is equal to this half, and this half is equal to this half. We don't know that the two entire diagonals are equal, but we do know that the two halves are equal to one another. The next property we have is that we have consecutive angles are supplementary. And consecutive means next to. So I'm looking at this angle and this angle together are supplementary. I could give those a name. I could call this A, B, C, D. And so angle A and angle B are supplementary. You also have A and D, B and C, and C and D. So they're anything that share a side. So the way that I would typically show that I would highlight that side so that you could see that very clearly, and imagine that those two are consecutive, or those two are next to each other, so they're supplementary. Opposite angles are congruent. So opposite angles are things like angle D and angle B. They are across from one another, and I have angle A and angle C. And we see that they're already marked with this information because I have the 1 tick marks and the 2 tick marks. But now we can go ahead and know that that's what that marking means. And so knowing consecutive and opposite, those are important to be able to differentiate, and we'll talk about that more when we talk more about parallelograms. Opposite sides are congruent. That means that this side is congruent to this side, and this side here is congruent to that side there. Notice that I used a different number of tick marks than I used for my diagonals, just so we make sure we know that those don't have to be the same length. Finally, I know that opposite sides are parallel. When I talk about things being parallel, I'm using the arrows. So this side is parallel to this side, and these two sides are parallel. And so this is my parallelogram. For my rectangle, I know all the properties of a parallelogram are going to be true, but I'm not going to draw all of those right now. I'm going to just focus on the two that are specific to just a rectangle. So that would be that the diagonals are congruent. So if I go ahead and mark this as rectangle A, B, C, D, then I know that I have AC is congruent to BD. And a lot of times the way that we show that would be to say that all of these pieces are congruent, but we know that because we know that these two diagonals are congruent to each other. And then we have 4 right angles. So the only thing that we need to know in order to know that we have a rectangle is just one of these two things being true. If we know one of these two things, then we know that we must have a rectangle. My rhombus has all the properties of a parallelogram, but it also has a couple other things that are true. Those diagonals are perpendicular. That means that they make a 90-degree angle. So this angle is 90 degrees, and all of these other angles in the center are going to be 90 degrees. So all 4 of those are, and if you know that one is, then you know that all of them are. And then this is one that people tend to struggle with, but we know that the diagonals bisect opposite angles. So if I was to highlight one of my diagonals, all of the angles that could be made between the diagonal and the sides of my rhombus are going to be congruent to one another. And the same thing would be true for the other diagonal, but these will be congruent to each other. So anything that touches the diagonal that's highlighted green, all 4 of those angles are going to be congruent. And anything that touches the diagonal that is not highlighted, all of those are going to be congruent. And then the last property I have is that I have 4 congruent sides. And if I know any one of these things at this point, then I know that I have a rhombus. For a square, notice that we have all the properties of a parallelogram. We have all the properties of a rectangle. We have all the properties of a rhombus. But the 2 specific things that make this a square is that I'm going to have 4 congruent sides, and I'm going to have 4 right angles. Those 2 things, both of them must be true. If they are not both true, then you either have a rectangle or you have a rhombus. But if you know that both of them are true, that's when you have a square. That ends our section on parallelograms and special parallelograms, but we have 3 other shapes that we look at. One of those shapes is called a kite, and a kite has diagonals that are perpendicular, just like a rhombus. Remember, we talked about that, meaning that all of these center angles are going to be 90 degrees. And it has 2 other things. It has 1 pair of opposite angles congruent, and it has 2 pairs of consecutive congruent sides. So this word consecutive, just like in our parallelogram consecutive angles, this means next to. So that would be that these 2 are congruent and these 2 are congruent. And the opposite angles are the ones that are located in between the sides of different lengths. So make sure you look at that carefully, make sure your picture looks just like mine. Because it can be very easy to mess up the kite. This is one that people tend to struggle with the drawing of. So I just want to make sure that this is all clear for everyone. 2 more shapes. One of these is called a trapezoid. A trapezoid has one pair of parallel sides. That's it. And because the only thing that we know is that we have one pair of parallel sides, there's nothing that we can do with this one to use for solving. And because of that, we then talk about a shape called an isosceles trapezoid. So an isosceles trapezoid is a more specific name for a type of trapezoid, and it still has that same first property, that it has one pair of parallel sides. However, it also has some other properties that we know to be true. So one of these is that the diagonals are congruent, just like in a rectangle. So that means that BD would be congruent to AC. But what we don't know is that it's like a parallelogram where it has that the diagonals are bisected. And because we don't know that piece of information, then we can't draw and say that each piece of the diagonals is congruent. Instead, we can just say that those two diagonals as a whole are congruent, but we can't say that the pieces are. And then we know that it has congruent legs. So the legs are going to be the sides that are not parallel. So this is congruent to this. And then it also has congruent base angles. And this is considered a base angle down at the bottom, but you could also flip the isosceles trapezoid around, and then those top ones would be base angles. So you actually end up having two pairs of things that are congruent. So your pictures should look just like mine, so that you can use your booklet as a reference sheet. As we work through more specifics, we're going to go through properties and solving for each of these different shapes over the next few weeks.